In the summer of 1939, before the rumble of war had shattered Europe, Joseph Goebbels stood on a grand stage in Berlin. The floodlights glinted off swastikas, the crowd roared, and his voice, clear and commanding, echoed over loudspeakers across the city. Every word was crafted, every gesture measured. Here was the master of a new kind of power, the power to reshape reality itself, to breathe lies, fears, and hopes into the hearts of millions. Goebbels believed that propaganda was not just a tool, it was the foundation of control. A famous statement attributed to him, though without firm source, runs, quote, "If you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. The lie can be maintained only for such time as the state can shield the people from the political, economic, and/or military consequences of the lie. It thus becomes vitally important for the state to use all its powers to repress dissent, for the truth is the mortal enemy of the lie, and thus, by extension, the truth is the greatest enemy of the state." End quote. Whether he actually spoke or wrote those words, the idea captures something essential: the Nazi regime's willingness to dissolve truth in its service, and to make deception into ritual, spectacle, and belief. He commanded radio waves, orchestrated rallies, shaped culture and entertainment. In doing so, he transformed propaganda into an immersive architecture. The speeches, the posters, the songs, and the images, all reinforcing a single worldview: Hitler as savior, Jews as enemies, Germany embattled and righteous. Goebbels understood that power lies not only in force, but in what people come to believe, and how they come to see themselves. So this is the voice that they heard, unwavering, seductive, and terrifying, because beneath the sound was discipline, and beneath discipline, fear. Fear not overtly expressed, but absorbed. By 1939, many in Germany saw no difference between the truth and the truth as Goebbels told it. This is how propaganda becomes reality. Welcome to Wars of the World. Born on the 29th of October 1897, Joseph Goebbels was raised in Reit, a modest industrial town on the Lower Rhine near Dusseldorf. His family was Catholic. His father, Fritz Goebbels, worked as a clerk in a wick factory, and his mother, Katharina Odenhausen, came from a farmhand background. He was one of several children: younger sisters Maria and Elizabeth, and older brothers Conrad and Hans, with another older sister dying in infancy before he was born. From his earliest years, his health was frail. He suffered from frequent lung inflammations, and early in his childhood, he developed a deformity in his right foot, which turned inwards and was shorter and thicker than his left. It was what is often described as a club foot, often being a consequence of infections or bone disease. After attempts to correct it, including treatment at a university clinic in Bonn, he was left with a permanently lame right foot. The physical disability excluded him from playing as freely as other children. He lost out on many games and outdoors excursions, and began a degree of social isolation. As Goebbels himself wrote, quote, "My youth from then on was pretty blighted. I was thrown back on my own devices. I could no longer play with the others. I became solitary, a loner." End quote. He began his elementary schooling around 1904 in Wright. He remembered teachers who were harsh. In his memoir-like writings, he refers to a teacher, Hennes, as a lying hound, and another, Hilgers, as a villain and a swine, and even speaks of the cane with stripes on his back being discovered by his mother. Even so, despite difficulties, Goebbels was precocious, independently minded, stubborn, and often proud. As he progressed, he attended grammar school in Wright. Although by his own account he was lazy and lethargic at times, he showed aptitude for languages, especially Greek and Latin, as well as religious studies and history. His parents had hoped he might become a priest, his religious upbringing deeply shaping his early worldview. But by his university years, his interests were turning more towards literature. In 1917, he completed his Abitur, being the equivalent to A-levels or a university entrance exam, ranking among the top of his class. He was even afforded the traditional honor of speaking at the graduation ceremony. Then came university: Bonn, Würzburg, Freiburg, Munich, before finally Heidelberg. At Heidelberg in 1921, he earned his PhD in German philology and literature, with a thesis on Wilhelm von Schütz, a minor 19th century romantic dramatist. Even before and during his studies, he harbored literary ambitions. He wrote essays, poetry, drama, and fiction, and from around the age of 12 he would write a diary. He saw in literature a way to express discontent with what he perceived as the decline of German culture, materialism, and what he judged as an absence of style or eternal values. After completing his doctorate, he tried to make a living through private tutoring and submitting articles to local newspapers. But the financial returns were meager, rejection was frequent, and success elusive. These early years, his health problems, physical deformity, strict but loving Catholic home, intellectual promise, and early failure laid the groundwork for the person he would become. Fiercely proud, deeply conscious of compensating for his perceived weaknesses, fascinated by symbolism, drama, suffering, and the power of words. His solitude pushed him into reading, into self-reflection, into writing diaries and fictionalized versions of himself. It is in these formative years and isolated upbringing that we begin to see the seeds of the master propagandist. After the Great War, Germany lay in ruins. The collapse of the imperial government, the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles, rampant inflation, and political instability. All these left many young Germans disoriented and angry. The young Joseph Goebbels, being rejected for military service in World War I because of his deformity, felt this loss of status acutely. Freshly graduated with a doctorate in 1922, he had long harbored grievances. The sense of betrayal at Versailles, the chaos of the Weimar Republic, and above all, the failure he saw in German society. Urbanization, materialism, and a loss of what he considered authentic culture. He began moving in nationalist circles, the desperate climate making radical ideas all the more appealing. In late 1924, Goebbels offered his services to Karl Kaufmann, the district leader, or Chorleiter, of the Rhine-Ruhr district for the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or NSDAP, colloquially known as the Nazi Party. Kaufmann would introduce him to Gregor Strasser, a powerful figure of the left wing of the Nazi Party, which combined German nationalism with socialist-tinged economic ideas. Strasser's beliefs in stronger state control, anti-capitalist rhetoric, and emphasis on the people's betrayal by elites all resonated with Goebbels. Under Strasser's influence, he worked on regional newspapers and helped organize party offices, his early contributions being journalistic and organizational. By the mid-1920s, Goebbels was also developing his own sense for public speaking and a flair for dramatic expression. He founded the Nationalsozialistische Briefe, or the National Socialist Letters, a pamphlet series which carried the radical social revolutionary outlook of the party's leftist wing. He viewed many of the economic proposals of Strasserism as necessary corrections to what he saw as Germany's collapse under post-war liberalism. But he was not yet fully committed to the party. Some of his diary entries at the time show tension, an admiration, yes, for Strasser's socio-economic radicalism, but aversion to Hitler's flatter mass populism. But there was also a recognition that Hitler carried something that no one else did: magnetism, leadership, and visible power. The turning point came in 1926, especially around the Bamberg Conference. Hitler convened this meeting to resolve internal disputes, especially between Strasser and the party leadership, over how radical the NSDAP should be on economic and social policy. Hitler travelled personally to meet with Goebbels, Franz Pfeffer von Solomon, and Karl Kaufmann, offering reconciliation, personal attention, and promises of influence. Goebbels himself was deeply impressed. He wrote in his diary, quote, "Adolf Hitler, I love you because you are both great and simple at the same time, what one calls a genius." End quote. By the autumn of 1926, Goebbels made a decisive move. He broke with Strasser's overt program and aligned himself fully with Hitler. Hitler rewarded him by appointing him Gauleiter of the Berlin-Brandenburg district, giving him a key position in the Nazi apparatus. In this new role, Goebbels had both administrative power and tools for propaganda: newspapers, local organization, and rallies. Berlin had offered him a large stage, and he relished upon it. Throughout these early years, Goebbels' political style solidified: opportunistic, fiercely ambitious, ideologically radical but practical. He blended theatricality with ruthless calculation. He experimented with propaganda publications, speeches, and public stunts, not yet as the propaganda minister, but already mastering the art of appealing to emotion, fear, national humiliation, and hope. But more than that, he saw the power of a personal bond with a leader, the symbolic value of loyalty, and how propaganda begins not on paper, but in allegiance, in spectacle, and in the art of persuasion. When Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor on January 30th, 1933, Joseph Goebbels was already lurking in the wings of power. His reward would come on March 13th, 1933, when he was appointed Reich Minister for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, placing him fully in charge of nearly all channels of mass communication in Germany. From that moment, the machinery of propaganda was no longer just a tool for party agitation. It became a full-blown instrument of state. Goebbels took office with sweeping powers. Within weeks, he oversaw the creation of the Reich Chamber of Culture, which grouped together all creators of cultural goods: writers, musicians, actors, filmmakers, and visual artists. Through this chamber, the regime could exclude Jews and other politically unreliable individuals from cultural production, and to force approved works into the center stage of German life. The press came under immediate attack. Publications were told whom they could employ, editors were removed, and newspapers that didn't toe the line were either shut down or absorbed. For example, on the 4th of October 1933, the Schriftleitergesetz, or Editor's Law, defined strict qualifications for editors, based on racial, ideological, and educational criteria, and thereby institutionalized direct state control over what the public could read. Goebbels also understood that spectacle had power. Mass rallies, torchlight parades, radio broadcasts, and film. Each element was orchestrated for maximum dramatic effect. At the moment when Hitler became Chancellor, Goebbels ordered state radio to carry a live broadcast of torchlights, celebrating Hitler's rise to power. These public events served multiple functions: intimidation of opponents, affirmation of support, and the myth-making around the figure of the Führer. The image of Hitler was central, the charismatic leader, unifier, and personification of Germany's rebirth. As one historian notes, quote, "Hitler had indeed cause to be grateful to his propaganda leader, who was the true creator and organizer of the Führer myth, of the image of the Messiah Redeemer, feeding the theatrical element in the Nazi leader, while at the same time inducing the self-surrender of the German masses through skillful stage management and manipulation." End quote. Censorship was everywhere. On May 10th, 1933, Goebbels presided over the ritual book burnings in Berlin, where un-German works by Jewish authors, political dissidents, pacifists, and foreigners were destroyed in huge bonfires. Libraries were purged, blacklists were drawn up, and degenerate art was banned. The policy was not simply to suppress dissent, but to offer an approved culture, one steeped in nationalism, racially defined purity, and the glorification of the state. Goebbels' grip extended into broadcasting and cinema. Radio, still relatively new, was leveraged to reach ordinary Germans in their homes. His goals for the use of radio was made perfectly clear when he messaged the directors of radio stations in Berlin. Quote, "The radio belongs to us and to no one else. We will make the radio a tool for our cause, and no other values will be presented by it." End quote. He also supervised film production and newsreels. Propaganda films were shown in cinemas before features, and visual images of Nazi festivals and choreography of mass marches were proliferated. Theatrical and musical works which didn't conform to the new standards were either banned or adapted to suit their ideologies. Within the ministry, Goebbels issued detailed directives, not just what should be published, but how things should be reported or omitted. The press was given instructions about which topics to cover, which to ignore, and how to frame every issue, from Jewish immigration to economic policy, to the supposed threats posed by the communists. Editors became functionaries of the regime. To fail was not merely career suicide, but a threat to one's physical safety. Although many in the Nazi hierarchy would compete for influence, Goebbels' ministry put propaganda at the core of the regime's identity. Each slogan, each rally, each approved piece of art served to cultivate the image of Hitler as the savior who would unify the Volksgemeinschaft, or the people's community, around him. The combination of censorship, spectacle, and message discipline transformed propaganda from mere persuasion into an almost ritual practice. The media became an orchestrated performance, and Goebbels was the conductor. By the mid-1930s, the regime under Goebbels had achieved something more than mere control of media. They had woven the Nazi worldview so deeply into daily life that dissent or alternative perspectives became almost unthinkable. From homes to schools, from songs to textbooks, from the factory floor to the leisure weekend, the average German was surrounded by a reality shaped, filtered, and interpreted through Nazi hands. The effect was not simply persuasion. It was making the regime's ideology the very air that people breathed. In the home, the Volksempfänger, or people's receiver, made radio a linchpin of that saturation. Introduced to be affordable for workers, it ensured that many households could receive broadcasts which were directly controlled by Goebbels' ministry. This wasn't just news, it was music, speeches, culture, and light entertainment, all framed within Nazi-approved values. By insulating people from foreign broadcasts, censoring content, and manipulating the times of popular broadcasts, the regime ensured that what entered the ears of millions carried with it a simple and subconscious message: that there is no alternative. In public spaces, loudspeakers on street corners, in factories, and in town squares relayed speeches, news, and regime-approved music. Every major rally, public parade, or holiday was leveraged to reinforce belonging to the Volksgemeinschaft. Posters on wall newspapers, such as Wochenspruch der NSDAP, were ubiquitous, with quotations from Nazi leaders, images of heroic Aryan figures, and symbols of unity and racial purity. These were not optional extras. They were part of what citizens saw when they travelled, shopped, worked, or socialized. Perhaps the deepest effects were felt in education and youth organizations. The school curriculum was overhauled to emphasize Nazi racial theory, German history rewritten to glorify conquest and sacrifice, biology to teach racial hygiene, physical fitness, and loyalty to the Führer. Children's textbooks and stories downplayed critical thinking and emphasized obedience, racial inferiority of the Jews, and glorious destiny of Germans. The youth organizations, the Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls, did not simply supplement school, they extended ideological instruction beyond the classroom into weekend camps, uniformed activities, and camps of labor service, all of them instilling discipline, mythic symbolism, and collective ritual. Alfons Heck, who rose to a high position in the Hitler Youth before the end of the war, describes how, quote, "We 5- and 6-year-olds knew nothing of the freedom of the Weimar Republic. More than any other political party, the NSDAP recognized that those who control the children own the future. We swallowed our daily dose of nationalistic instruction as naturally as our morning milk." End quote. Information about what was not permitted became as powerful as what was. Books by Jewish authors, pacifists, socialists, and anything considered degenerate was banned, burned, or forced out of libraries. Teachers swore loyalty oaths. Authors, artists, and musicians who did not conform either adapted or were silenced. The regime's censorship and its punishment for dissent cultivated an atmosphere of fear. Speaking out or seeking alternative viewpoints could mean a loss of job, imprisonment, or worse. Ordinary people learned to self-censor. So what did all of this do to how Germans saw themselves and the world? Over time, many came to treat the Nazi vision not as one more ideology among others, but instead as the default. The concepts of purity, race, duty, loyalty, and the Führer became embedded in the moral vocabulary of day-to-day life. When anti-Jewish laws were introduced, many didn't even question them. When violence against Jews escalated, much of the population remained passive, partly because the groundwork had been laid. Jews had been labelled as others, dehumanized repeatedly in film, newspapers, and in education. Propaganda had built up a legitimacy for persecution before it had even begun to happen. Empirical studies after the war support this. Research in recent decades demonstrates that those who were educated under the Nazi system, exposed to youth organizations and Nazi schooling, display stronger anti-Semitic beliefs lasting into later life than those born after or before that cohort. The young were not simply caring recipients. They were shaped, molded, smoothed out by institutions that claimed to care for the minds, bodies, leisure, and loyalties of their young. And yet, saturation did not always mean unanimity. There were Germans who resisted, who questioned, who hid forbidden books, or listened to foreign radio. But even resistance was shaped by propaganda, rumors, secrecy, and fear. For most, however, the propaganda machine succeeded in making the Nazi narrative the lens through which they interpreted politics, community, history, and identity. Goebbels' achievement was not merely that he controlled what Germans heard and saw, but that he shaped what many Germans felt was real. And in such an environment, the regime's worldview ceased to simply be propaganda. To many, it became the values of ordinary life. Joseph Goebbels' anti-Semitism was both deeply personal and politically instrumental. From the early years of the Nazi Party, he regarded Jews not only as a religious or ethnic group, but as an existential threat to Germany and the Third Reich. In his diaries, he frequently expressed virulent hatred, describing Jews as parasites or vermin who undermined German culture and morality, and asserting that their elimination was necessary to secure the nation's future. As part of a speech in June 1943, he delivers a simple line that makes his ideology perfectly clear. Quote, "Just like a potato beetle destroys potatoes, the Jew destroys nations and peoples. There is only one solution to deal radically with the danger." End quote. Once in control of the Ministry for Propaganda, Goebbels wielded his influence to embed these views throughout German society, playing a pivotal role in escalating the persecution of Jews. The infamous book burnings of 1933, organized in part by his ministry, symbolically erased Jewish and un-German literature from cultural life. Goebbels delivered speeches at these events, framing the purges as a defense of national purity and culture. He wrote that, quote, "The spirit of the German people must be protected from foreign corruption," end quote, signaling the intertwining of ideology and propaganda. The anti-Jewish campaigns escalated with Kristallnacht in November 1938, a pogrom that Goebbels actively encouraged and publicly framed as a spontaneous reaction to the assassination of a German diplomat in Paris. The Night of Broken Glass. so called for the shards of glass that littered the streets. It consisted primarily of the Nazis' SA and SS, along with some members of the Hitler Youth and German civilians, throughout Germany destroying and smashing Jewish-owned stores, buildings and synagogues, with the German authorities looking on without intervening. On top of this, around 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and incarcerated in concentration camps, often from committing no other crime than simply being Jewish. In Goebbels' speeches and directives, he ensured that the media presented the violence as justified and necessary, intensifying public hostility towards Jews, while simultaneously providing cover for the state-sanctioned destruction of both property and lives. His hatred ran so deep that in his diaries, Goebbels expressed a relentless drive to solve the Jewish question, often advocating for measures that went beyond the policies of his contemporaries. On February 5th, 1942, he wrote, quote, "The Jewish question is again giving us a headache. This time, however, not because we have gone too far, but because we are not going far enough. Among large sections of the German people, the idea is gaining headway that the Jewish question cannot be regarded as solved until all Jews have left the Reich." End quote. This entry came just weeks after the Wannsee Conference of January 1942. This was where senior Nazi officials formalized plans for what they called the final solution of the Jewish question. Goebbels was not present at Wannsee, but his diary shows that he was aware of and endorsed the radicalization of anti-Jewish policy, from expulsion to extermination. In later entries, he wrote approvingly of, quote, "our radical and decisive policy against the Jews," end quote, framing it as a historic mission. His propaganda ministry echoed this language in the press and on the radio, using euphemisms such as evacuation or resettlement to mask the reality of mass murder, while portraying Jews as saboteurs and enemies of the Reich. Through these channels, Goebbels helped prepare the German public to accept the deportations and killings that followed. He amplified Hitler's threats about Jewish annihilation, justified pogroms like Kristallnacht as defensive acts, and presented the Holocaust itself as a grim but necessary wartime measure. In doing so, he was not simply a propagandist reflecting policy, but an eager advocate of genocide, giving ideological and rhetorical cover to the regime's most terrible crimes. Joseph Goebbels' unwavering loyalty to Adolf Hitler was a defining feature of his career. From their first meeting in 1925, Goebbels was captivated by Hitler's charisma and vision, often expressing deep admiration in his diaries. He often referred to Hitler as a genius, showing his profound devotion when writing about one of Hitler's speeches. He said, quote, "It is impossible to reproduce what Hitler has said. It must be experienced. He is a genius, the natural, creative instrument of a fate determined by God. I am deeply moved." End quote. Goebbels' position as Reich Minister of Propaganda placed him in direct contact with Hitler, allowing him to shape public perception and reinforce the Führer's image. His skill at manipulating media, orchestrating speeches, and controlling cultural output secured him a trusted place in the inner circle, but it also required careful navigation of rivalries among the other senior Nazis. Hermann Göring, Hitler's designated successor and head of the Luftwaffe, often clashed with Goebbels. Their rivalry stemmed from both ideological and personal tensions. Goebbels criticized Göring's ostentation and self-interest, while Göring resented Goebbels' influence over Hitler and considered his propaganda efforts as manipulative and self-aggrandizing. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, maintained a more distant relationship with Goebbels. While both men were devoted to Hitler, Himmler's secretive, bureaucratic style and mystical inclinations often contrasted with Goebbels' public, performative approach. Goebbels recorded his skepticism of Himmler's worldview in his diaries, regarding it as both impractical and excessive, and often criticized Himmler's esoteric beliefs, which he deemed nonsensical. Yet the two occasionally collaborated on campaigns that combined terror with propaganda, demonstrating the necessary pragmatism required to operate within Hitler's court. Despite these rivalries, Goebbels' position within the inner circle remained secure, thanks to his strategic alliances and his indispensable role in maintaining the Nazi narrative. His influence extended beyond politics, however, for he was also a family man. In 1931, he married Magda Quandt, a former secretary who shared his ideological convictions. Together, they had 6 children, and their family life was often portrayed as a model of Nazi values. However, Goebbels' personal life was not without scandal. In 1939, he began an affair with Czech actress Lida Barova, which became a source of tension within the inner circle. Hitler himself intervened, compelling Goebbels to end the relationship in order to preserve party discipline, a move that reinforced the extent to which personal actions were inseparable from political survival. Goebbels' relationships were not only defined by rivalry and discipline, but also by alliance and mutual dependence. Figures like Rudolf Hess and Albert Speer respected his ability to manage public opinion and maintain loyalty to Hitler, while his rapport with the Führer allowed him to act as a mediator in disputes between other leaders. Within this ecosystem of power, influence was constantly negotiated. Goebbels' political acumen and understanding of personal dynamics enabled him to strengthen his position and protect his role as Hitler's primary propagandist, even when tensions were simmering around him. With the onset of World War II, Joseph Goebbels, as Reich Minister of Propaganda, recognized the necessity to adapt his strategies to sustain public morale and support for the Nazi regime. The early successes of the Blitzkrieg campaigns were followed by prolonged engagements, notably the Battle of Stalingrad, which marked a significant turning point. In response, Goebbels intensified his propaganda efforts, shifting towards a narrative of total war in order to galvanize the German populace. Central to this strategy was the 1943 Totaler Krieg, or Total War speech, delivered by Goebbels at the Berlin Sportpalast on February 18th. In this address, he proclaimed, "Do you want total war?" A rhetorical question that elicited a resounding affirmative response from the carefully selected audience. Goebbels emphasized the necessity for complete mobilization of the nation's resources, urging citizens to contribute to the war effort through increased labor, resource conservation, and unwavering support for the military. The speech was a pivotal moment in Nazi propaganda, aiming to fortify the home front during a period of mounting challenges. Goebbels adeptly utilized various media to disseminate the total war message. The radio, in particular, became a ubiquitous presence in German households, broadcasting speeches, music, and news that reinforced Nazi ideology. The regime also capitalized on cinema as a tool for propaganda. Films like Kohlberg in 1945, directed by Fate Harlan, were produced to depict historical narratives that aligned with Nazi values, portraying German resistance against foreign invaders as a reflection of contemporary struggles. In addition to promoting unity, Goebbels' propaganda machine intensified efforts to vilify perceived enemies of the state. The Jewish population, along with communists and other minorities, were scapegoated as responsible for Germany's hardships. This demonization served to justify discriminatory policies and to foster a sense of collective identity among the more Aryan populace. But despite the fervent propaganda, the effectiveness of these efforts was mixed. While the initial response to the Totaler Krieg speech was enthusiastic, sustaining this momentum proved challenging. The realities of war, including shortages and mounting casualties, began to erode public morale. In response, Goebbels sought to bolster his influence within the Nazi leadership. In July 1944, he was appointed Reich Plenipotentiary for Total War, granting him greater authority over the war economy and mobilization efforts. By late 1944 and into early 1945, Goebbels' propaganda grew harsher and more urgent as Germany's situation deteriorated. Following the catastrophic defeats at Stalingrad in the east, the regime could no longer pretend that the war would be won quickly. Instead, Goebbels strove to maintain the illusion of resilience, even while subtly admitting crisis. He oversaw mobilization drives, not just of resources, but of people, even children, the elderly, and impaired veterans, through the Volkssturm, the national militia formed in October 1944. The propaganda surrounding this Home Guard force portrayed it as proof that every citizen could still defend the Reich. Speeches, posters, and newspaper headlines emphasized sacrifice, courage, and duty, even as the front lines collapsed. Goebbels' diary entries in January through to April 1945 reflect an increasing sense of despair. In his writing, he observed with painful irony the shrinking of German territory, the nightly air raids, the destruction of civilian infrastructure, and the weakening of the Luftwaffe. On the 13th of March 1945, Goebbels lamented that his own propaganda ministry building on Wilhelmstrasse had been destroyed by a mosquito raid. In the diary, he wrote of his grief at the loss of the rooms and halls reconstructed in painstaking detail, noting it as a bad omen. Quote, "I am overcome with sadness. It is 12 years to the day, 13th of March, since I entered this ministry as minister. It is the worst conceivable omen for the next 12 years." End quote. Such personal losses were leveraged through state radio and newspapers as symbols of the broader national suffering. They served to legitimize calls for sacrifice and to intensify the moral stakes of resistance. As Berlin came under direct assault, Goebbels attempted to control the narrative even as chaos pressed in. The Völkischer Beobachter, the party newspaper, became increasingly dominated by slogans and patriotic exhortations, such as "We will not surrender," "Fight to the end," "Every German must stand firm." The issues shrank because of paper shortages, and over time the content reduced to denunciations of the Allies, claims of internal and external treachery, and assurances that, despite setbacks, Germany's destiny was still just. Goebbels also used radio addresses to simultaneously decry the enemy's bombardments and to promise miraculous turnarounds. New weapons were coming, these V-weapons, or some last-minute counterattacks. On February 28, 1945, for example, one of his final radio addresses insisted on an iron will to persevere, emphasizing the deployment of their newest V-weapons, and warning of sacrifice and restrictions ahead. But the civilians hearing this only knew that the bombs were falling, the winter was freezing, and food was short, even as the rhetoric urged continuing faith. Despite the intensification of these measures, cracks in the propaganda's power grew evident. Civilian morale, long cultivated, began to shatter under hunger, cold, fear, and the realization that defeat was more than likely. Goebbels' record shows his frustration with other Nazi leaders, notably with Göring's performance of the Luftwaffe, and with Hitler's inability or unwillingness to make decisive changes. Quote, "I beg the Führer yet again to take action at last, since things cannot go on like this. We ought not, after all, to send our people to their doom, because we do not possess the strength of decision to root out the cause of our misfortune." End quote. As Germany's defeat loomed, Goebbels' propaganda came to rely increasingly on desperation, mobilizing every citizen via the Volkssturm, using personal damage to dramatize collective suffering, shrinking but still insisting on unity, sacrifice, and belief. The machine that had once declared triumph now tried to declare endurance, to keep hope alive even when the structure beneath it was collapsing. As the Soviet army closed in on central Berlin in the final days of April 1945, Joseph Goebbels remained resolutely in the Führer bunker, unwavering in his loyalty to Adolf Hitler. The city above was in ruins, and the air was thick with smoke from the relentless bombardment. Despite the hopelessness of Germany's situation, Goebbels continued to orchestrate propaganda from his underground office, trying to maintain the illusion of order and courage among those who remained. In his final speech on April 21, 1945, he addressed the people of Berlin. Quote, "Defenders of Berlin, the eyes of your wives, mothers, and children are on you. They have entrusted their life, their fortune, their health, and their future to you. You now know your task, and I know you will fulfill it in an exemplary manner. The hour of truth has come." End quote. Magda Goebbels shared her husband's grim determination. As the walls of the bunker closed in around them, the couple reached a chilling decision. Their lives and those of their 6 children would end together. The children, Helga, Hildegard, Helmut, Holdine, Hedwig, and Heidrun, aged between 4 and 12, were sedated with morphine by SS dentist Helmut Kunz, then given cyanide to complete the act. Traudl Junge recalled Magda's grim conviction, recounting that she wanted to, quote, "protect her children from living in disgrace under the rule of the victors." End quote. Rochus Misch, the bunker's telephone operator, later described seeing the children innocently playing moments before their deaths, completely unaware of the fate that awaited them. After the children's deaths, Joseph and Magda Goebbels left the bunker and moved into the Reich Chancellery Garden. It was here that they took their own lives. Accounts differ slightly. Some suggest they ingested cyanide, while others report that Joseph was shot to ensure his death. The bodies were found partially burned, by Soviet troops on May 2nd, 1945, in the Chancellery Garden alongside the remains of the Goebbels children, marking a grim punctuation to the family's final hours. The atmosphere within the bunker during these last few days was tense and surreal. Propaganda that had once rallied an entire nation now seemed hollow. The minister who had orchestrated the Third Reich's messaging was reduced to a man clinging to delusion. In his final diaries, Goebbels lamented the collapse around him, reflecting a mixture of defiance and despair. His death, along with Magda's and their children, silenced one of the most powerful propagandists in history and left a haunting legacy of loyalty, fanaticism, and the human cost of ideological obsession. Goebbels' name has become almost synonymous with propaganda. Not simply the old arts of lying or spin, but the systematic manipulation of truth, culture, trauma, and identity. His enduring infamy rests not just in association with Nazi crimes, but in how skillfully he demonstrated propaganda's power to reshape what people believe, what they fear, and how they see themselves. Goebbels showed that propaganda could be more than persuasion. It could become reality. Modern scholarship treats Goebbels as a case study in propaganda's mechanics. Philosophers like Jason Stanley, in How Propaganda Works, argue that propaganda undermines democracy by suppressing genuine discourse, by making certain ideas unthinkable, and by enabling moral indifference. Stanley's framework helps us to see that what Goebbels did was not an aberration of totalitarianism, but something many societies are vulnerable to: the corroding of public reason, the exploitation of fear and identity, and the presentation of misinformation or manipulative imagery as everyday truth. Something which we can all relate to when we consider modern-day fake news. Film and culture continue to explore Goebbels' legacy. The recent film Goebbels and the Führer dramatizes his role in shaping public opinion, from the run-up to Kristallnacht right through to the end in the Führer bunker. It seeks not only to depict historical events, but also to expose how demagoguery and disinformation were orchestrated, providing a mirror for modern audiences to see how propaganda still functions in today's media environment. Other works, like David Welch's Propaganda and the German Cinema 1933 to 1945, trace how even entertainment, which might seem benign, was often infused with ideological messages, covertly reinforcing values of racial purity, obedience, and the Führer principle, under the guise of heroism or tradition. So, what lessons can we draw from Goebbels that still matter today? First, that propaganda is not effective purely by force. It is often most dangerous when it works through culture, media, and education, when the audience is gradually saturated so that alternatives seem impossible. Second, that the aesthetic power of drama, ceremony, music, film, and radio, all the tools which Goebbels used, can mask atrocity, turning moral blindness into normality. And third, that societies must cultivate critical thinking, preserve free media, and resist the temptation of easy narratives, because once propaganda takes hold, undoing it becomes painfully costly. But often, identifying propaganda at all can be the hardest of tasks, as Goebbels himself sums up, quote, "This is the secret of propaganda. He who is the target of propaganda should be completely immersed in the ideas of propaganda, without him ever noticing that he is being immersed." End quote. Several decades have passed since the death of Goebbels and the end of the Second World War. But in many ways, his ideas live on, in how media can manipulate memory, in how leaders still seek to control the story. His legacy warns us that control over images, words, and symbols is not a side operation of politics. It is often its beating heart.